No propaganda, no lies, and definitely no BS. You're with George Eliason, live from Donbass, Ukraine, on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm your host, George Eliason. Welcome to the weekend edition. We've got a special guest today, award-winning journalist, Vanessa Beeley. Now, Vanessa is the daughter of a former British diplomat, Harold Beeley. Vanessa, hello and welcome.
Hi, George. Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's nice to finally talk to you.
Oh, it's great to talk to you, too. Now, you're a Serena Shim Award winner for uncompromised integrity in journalism, and that has to do with your work in Syria, correct?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it does, and including the work I did previously in Palestine, as it did, of course, with Eva Bartlett, who's a very dear colleague. And I think we were the first two recipients of the award, which I believe you have also won.
Yes. I was honored with that. You and Eva really, and I think of journalists in that region, and it's only you two that, it's the first two people names in my mind. Now, you started in journalism in Palestine in 2014?
No, actually, in 2012, I entered Gaza. Actually, that's where I met Eva. Was at the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza. And she entered before me, actually, and I actually went in through the tunnels because, as you probably know, although it's Egyptian territory, it's very much controlled by Mossad, by Israeli intelligence. So entry into Gaza is very restricted by the Zionist entity, not by the Egyptians so much. So we entered by the tunnels. And then 2 days after we entered, the 2012 Israeli bombing started, which lasted, I think it was 2 weeks back in 2012. So we had no way of, not that I would have tried to get out anyway, but we were pretty much stuck there then. And I can safely say, having experienced war zones as you have, I think I can safely say there is nothing to compare to Zionist aggression. It's psychotic in its savagery. Effectively, Gaza is an open-air prison, but it's also used as an experimental area for American, U.S. weapons that are supplied to Israel. And so every mowing of the lawn, as they call it, they will roll out the latest weapons, the latest bombs, the latest killing machines against the Gazan people.
Now, going there, did you go there originally as an activist, or did you say, I need to report on this? That's why I'm going.
No, I mean, I think I think I'm right in saying, certainly Eva would agree with me, that I think, the journalism grows out of the activism. I mean, I went there very much on a kind of personal odyssey. You mentioned my father, Harold Beeley, who was probably one of the most iconic Arabists of his time, and certainly one of the very few at the end of the Second World War that was pushing back against the Truman Doctrine for Jewish refugee settlement in Palestine. And of course, he came under attack from the Israeli terrorist groups like the Stern Gang and Irgun, etc., that have, of course, connections to Ukraine also.
Right.
And that was really the last window of opportunity when my father and his various colleagues, like Patrick Mayhew, Tony Nutting, who resigned actually over the Truman policy to allow settlement in Palestine. And my father wrote an entire paper for Ernest Bevin, who was also anti-Zionist as foreign minister at the time, stating that, this would lead to decades of bloody conflict. And of course, he was absolutely right. And for all his life, he defended the Palestinian cause. Even after he retired, he was a close, I won't say ally, but he was a close confidant of Gamal Abdel Nasser, of course, the president of Egypt. And for that reason, Nasser only allowed my father back into the country in 1967 during the kind of repair of the Six-Day War. So, my father's legacy kind of stuck with me. He died in 2001, and I inherited all of his private papers, which I started going through. And so in 2012, I went back to Egypt, and from there to Gaza. So, as I said, it was a personal journey, which then developed into, I guess, what it is now. I'm sure for you as well, once you see certain things, you can't unsee them. And
exactly.
What becomes important to us is to transmit the unseeable to those that are not being allowed to see it. And I think, that's my driver, that's Eva's driver, I'm quite sure it's your driver. The monetary aspect has no value other than it enables us to do the job we do. But I can safely say that that's my driving force, is that too many of these things are left unseen by Western media that is paid to disappear these crimes committed by the allies of their governments, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that. The whole thing, like, what you just said about, how you got started, Eva, 2014, it was the oddest. I never pictured myself in this position. I mean, I didn't come to Ukraine for the war. I was here a long time before that. But here I am in January 2014, writing about the revival of Nazism, of all things.
Yeah.
And I'm writing in a Jewish publication, and I'm providing all the facts, and they're like, okay, we can't print your name. I said, no, you have to print my name. Someone has to be responsible for the information. Yeah, but they'll kill you. Yeah, well, someone has to be responsible. And they're like, we need to double check this. So they're grabbing all the other Jewish people they can find. Is this true? Is this Jewish Ukrainian? Oh, come here. What is this? And they're checking. He's right. But this is just so off the wall. Okay, real Nazis. What do we do with this? And it went from there. Half the publication actually supported Nazism in Ukraine, still does. So I was fighting that the whole time. You and Eva have had it, as odd as my experience was, you guys have had your backs to the wall from the beginning. The onslaught against you has just been horrendous.
Yeah.
I've seen groups like Bellingcat.
Oh God, yeah. Well, I mean, it's really, we've had pretty much the entire media complex battling us from day one. And I have to say, not only myself and Eva, but a very good journalist, Shamin Nawani, who actually was on the ground in Syria before Eva, because she was reporting from 2012 onwards, based in Lebanon. And she came under, incredibly heavy fire very early on. Yeah. Because, of course, she was exposing the very early propaganda constructs and fabrications of narratives and so on that have later been proven to be correct. So she was very much ahead of her times. Eva came in 2014, and I finally got in. I'd been trying since 2015, but I got in 2016. And from then on in, of course, we were really battling to get the alternative and diverging views to the dominant narratives in Western media out there, you know, from on the ground. I mean, this is the thing, and I'm sure you find this also in Ukraine. The majority of these journalists are quite safely in their offices in London, Washington, Beirut, or Istanbul, and reporting from there. Or, of course, they're embedded with the armed groups, the terrorist armed groups in areas that are controlled by those armed groups, backed by NATO states, right? So they're not in the bulk of the war zone inside Syria proper, alongside the Syrian Arab Army and allies and the Syrian people, because this is another thing, you know, the Western media has done a very good job on persuading people in the West that the Syrian Arab Army is either some kind of Assad controlled militia, or is completely separate from the Syrian people and sectarian, which is nonsense. The Syrian Arab Army is it's a conscript army. It's the Syrian people, okay? Every single family in this country has suffered at least one martyr. There are many, and I interviewed one mother in close to Salamiyah, near Hama, to the north of Damascus. Al-Fuz, her name is, mother of Fuz. She lost 5 sons, 5. Okay. I mean, you know, I can't even imagine the grief that she must have endured. And that's not an isolated case. It's not an isolated case. And, you know, people forget the massacres that went before this war, before 2011. The CIA and MI6 have been interfering in Syria since its independence from French mandate in 1946, with relentlessly. I mean, there are endless, I've written about it in great detail, there are endless CIA, DIA documents covering this. WikiLeaks has covered it. You know, the late 70s, early 80s, that was another Muslim Brotherhood instrumentalized uprising. Of course, we only ever hear about the Hafez al-Assad put down of that uprising. We don't hear about the massacres that were committed by the Muslim Brotherhood leading up to the final crackdown in Hama in 1982. We don't hear about any of those atrocities, just as we don't hear about them since 2011, really. You know, I mean, I know Eva has, and I have endless testimony. I haven't even published many of the testimonies that I've gathered because there's just too many.
Well, I followed some reports on them, and they're everywhere. And they try to blend into the background so much that their own groups don't recognize their own groups. You know, it's not Muslim at all. It's political, and they follow Cubist philosophy, which is where all the violence in the Middle East comes from.
And I mean, it's this, you know, I see a very direct line of connection between the Nazism in Ukraine, the Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and Zionism. You know, they all have that same, and there are connections between them also. As we know through history, there's a huge connection between Nazism and Zionism, for example, as an ultra-secular, ultra-nationalist, elitist cult, because that's effectively what Zionism is. You know, many Jews will disassociate themselves from Zionism for that reason, as will many Muslims from Wahhabism or from Ikhwan, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, which again is another construct created by the British in Egypt in the late 1930s.
Well, do you know where all of this started in terms of philosophy? There's a little city called Poltava. Western Ukraine. In the 18th, it was in the 1750s is where his philosophy actually started. And it spread through In the early 1910, it started spreading through, they had Middle East chapters that influenced Wahhabism, and the whole thing was about nationalism and creating united nationalist groups across the world. So it's not, it's very, very traceable all the way through. And the man responsible for it is actually the origin of Zionism. His name was Jacob Frank. Yeah. And he's actually the origin of nationalism as it sits in its worst forms. Zionism as it sits in its worst form. And part of his cult, and you're right to describe it that way, you had to apostatize from your religion and go into another religion. And the more of these that you fulfilled the requirements and apostatized from, the higher you could rise in the organization. So he's Jewish, he turned Catholic, and then he went Muslim. The originator of that was a guy named Sabbatai Zevi. And, you know, declaring yourself king in 666 is, you know, 1666 is quite a feat. You know, he was the coming of Christ in the Jewish form. But enough of that. So, you know,
I mean, it's kind of fascinating, though. Sorry.
You know, I'm the guy that, you know, I apologize for it too. Okay. Oh, you want to talk about that? Okay. We'll open up the academic books and, okay. You and Eva, literally, you know, you've, for me, you're icons, your work. And it's just the fact that, I can't believe the work you've done and the effect you've had. You know, you've got that. It was actually the top information operations company in the world that was trying to stop both your work in Syria. They were working Syria. The whole white helmet thing, media blitz, everything about it was their baby. And Bellingcat was working for them, and Bellingcat got all their information out of Ukraine, the Ukraine unit. Now, when Elliot Higgins is talking to a Homeland Security trainer and saying, we have to stop Van Beeley because what she's saying, her information might make it into the president's daily briefing. We have to stop this. Okay?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that tweet.
That's the impact. That's the impact you're having. You were shaping policy, both of you. And quite frankly, for the better.
Yeah, I mean, how can I put this? You know, I tend to say it, I'm just doing my job, and I'm just putting out the information that I try to corroborate and evidence as much as I can from on the ground and from external research. To some degree, I think we were both not surprised by the savagery of the attacks, because obviously the more we were being heard, the more we were attacked. Of course, that's that's normal, because we were annoying them, right? We were disrupting their clear run on the propaganda, and they didn't like it.
That's actually a better term for it too.
Yeah,
that's the better word.
Yeah, you know, and at the end of the day, they tried. But I think both Eva and I tend to see it. In the beginning, it was all a little bit kind of disturbing to suddenly be totally misrepresented in this way, and to have our motives framed in such a dishonest, nefarious way, and also to some degree to put us at risk, you know, on the ground in Syria, because they were making us very high profile when we were in very high risk areas, and I'm quite sure that that was deliberate. I mean, for example, more recently, the BBC doxed my car here. They actually published photos of my car with the number plate. And they made it perfectly clear that I was an enemy of the terrorist groups in a kind of 8,000 word article that was published on the front page of their website. So, you know, and they had me detained at Heathrow Airport when I went home for the first time since 2020 to visit my family. I was detained for 6 hours, and I was questioned as someone supplying secrets to the Russian secret services. And they downloaded everything from my mobile. And from the questioning, I'm pretty certain that they were tipped off by the BBC, because only the BBC had invested itself in that particular narrative, right? So, you know, the BBC and all of these media outfits are really nothing more than media hitmen for the regimes they work for. That's how I perceive them now. They're there to silence. I mean, you know, we have Alina Lipnau in Donbass, the German journalist, who's effectively got sanctions against her. Graham Phillips, the UK government has sanctioned him directly. From the rhetoric that's coming out of the British government, Liz Truss in particular, and she's very likely to be the next PM, we know that there's, you know, an incoming storm of censorship. Not that it's not already bad enough. I mean, bear in mind Julian Assange and everything that's been...
Right.
Yeah, it's going to get a lot worse. We're going to be demonetized, number one. We're going to be possibly physically attacked or disappeared. You know, this is a risk that really we do all face. But I always remember
before we get into that further,
go on.
We have to take a break. I'm being told by the panel guy. We're going to pick this up right here when we get back. This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm George Eliason, and we'll see you in a minute.
TNT Radio's Hervoy Morich.
Apparently, you've ended up on an FBI or a terror watch list, and your website, thiscan'tbehappening.net, has been labeled a threat by the DHS. I was banned from PayPal, and I believe that it was also the DHS who told PayPal. How did you get on the watch list, and as well as your website being labeled a threat?
The terrorism watch list has gone completely off the rails. There's over 1 million people on it, and the way you get on came out in a trial that was brought by CARE. They filed suit because a lot of the people who are on it are people with Islamic names. You know, they found out that the FBI is using the terrorism watch list in Islamic communities.
Hervoy Morich on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702 or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Bullets are not shot at us from the barrels of guns. Poisons are shot into us from the barrels of syringes. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm your host, George Eliason. Welcome back. I'm with Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, welcome back. And let's pick up where we left off. You were talking about being stopped at the airport and the fact that this could escalate to violence very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the fact that, you know, the censorship against dissenting voices is already pretty bad, but it's going to get an awful lot worse, I think, in the future, and even to the point where, yeah, you know, there is, but I mean, okay, let's talk about the Serena Shim Award. I mean, the reason the award was set up because Serena Shim in 2014 for Press TV, although she's a US citizen, was reporting on the smuggling of weapons and militants and even chemical weapons across the border in NGO humanitarian supply trucks. So she demonstrated that Turkey was involved in this cross-border gun running and militant running and chemical weapon ingredient running. And lo and behold, she received death threats, which she mentioned on air. And the same day, from memory, she was killed when she was driving back on Turkish roads. She was hit by a lorry in the middle of nowhere and was killed outright, you know? So that was back in 2014. So that was, let's say, at the beginning of the war against Syria, before Russia got involved, right? Right. And before the White Helmets had really kind of launched their campaign, because they were established in 2013, in my view, in response to the media failure to keep the narrative going. The West expected the war against Syria to be over in a few months, right? So that they were a little bit kind of lackadaisical, actually, over the holes in their media narratives. And when the war continued, because the Syrian Arab Army resisted, they realized that they needed to bring in something more solid that would give the governments plausible deniability. And that's why the White Helmets were manufactured and put in place alongside the armed groups. But of course, the blueprint of all of that began even as far back as former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, when the same guy that created the White Helmets was working on the transformation of the Kosovo Liberation Army. Also, of course, Al-Qaeda dominated and Albanian warlords, and transforming them into the Kosovo Security Corps. And that was James Lemessurier. So he was working for the British government, basically whitewashing Al-Qaeda in 1999, and then he transferred that expertise to Syria in 2013 when he established the White Helmets, not in Syria, in Turkey and Jordan.
Well, thanks to you, the work you two did on that, they actually attempted to raise up the White Helmets in Ukraine, and it was a complete and utter failure. And it's due to the work you two did that it was just the attempt was just so easy to recognize and brush off that they gave up on it right away. So thank you for that. Now, no problem. You said they doxed you, and they were publish images of your car. Other than to have someone physically find you, what other purpose would that have?
Oh, well, I mean, the thing is that they know that Eva and I are often operating on frontline. So, if you like, it makes us more visible. It makes us better known to the terrorist group factions, to the White Helmets, for example. I mean, it was 2018 when I entered Dara to the south of Damascus for the first time after the peace negotiations were kind of ongoing. They weren't fully finalized between Russia and the armed groups in Dar al-Balad and various other areas that had been occupied by armed groups that were collaborating with Al-Qaeda, but were the Muslim Brotherhood factions, whether it's Free Syrian Army or whatever branch they splintered off into. And I always remember that I'd gone there to investigate a particular massacre of Syrian Arab Army soldiers at the airbase close to Dar al-Balad center. And I wanted to visit the airbase. And this is where war becomes quite surreal, because the group that had carried out the massacre were actually escorting us.
Wow.
So Shabab al-Sunnah, who had actually massacred the Syrian Arab Army soldiers that I was looking into. I mean, I hadn't mentioned exactly what I was doing because I'm cautious in those kind of situations, but I told them I wanted to go to the airbase. So they took us to the airbase, and they were effectively, quite proud of what they had done. And we then came back to, we only had one Syrian army soldier with us, by the way, as protection in this environment. So, for people to get an understanding of what it means to be working in this environment, you're very vulnerable. At any moment, you're very vulnerable to kidnapping, to attacks, to any manner of event. The only thing in this case, I think, that saved me, they knew I was a British journalist. So actually they assumed I was on their side, right? And again, this is very telling, because they're used to the BBC or to CNN and to all these media companies that have effectively been their friends of Al-Qaeda throughout the conflict since 2011. So someone from Britain to them means someone who's supporting their cause, right? But I was there with an Iranian, with a journalist from Al-Mayadeen. Luckily, he shoved all his microphone and Mayadeen logo equipment under the back seat as we arrived, so they didn't actually see it. So I got, if you like, a first-hand account of how the massacre was carried out, where the bodies were I mean, it was one of the worst massacres of POWs of the war. The bodies were dismembered. The body parts were put in plastic bags by the white helmets and dumped on the rubbish dump. You might remember the video of the white helmet guy clambering over the bodies on the back of the truck and holding up the head. Yeah. It was a video that it really shocked a lot of people at the time. And so I was trying to follow up on this whole story to put kind of, I don't want to say meat on the bones because that just sounds really wrong, but to evidence everything that happened and to link it to the white helmets. But what actually happened, they took us to what was a former Nusra Front center, and they were always, like in Ukraine, they were always established in schools, in hospitals, in these big buildings, right? And we entered an operating white helmet complex. The white helmets were there, who were probably connected to the guy who'd held the head up on the back of the truck. And at this point, my blood ran slightly cold. Well,
yeah, exactly.
Thank God they didn't. No, they didn't, because I think God was with me on that day, because I had my hair tied back. I had a hat on because it was really hot. And they obviously hadn't been following Western media. And again, as soon as they knew I was British, they started talking to me about funding. Like, can I talk to James LeMessurier? They hadn't been paid for 6 months. Can I talk to the British government? Please, can I turn back on the funding tap? But then to add to that, right, the leader of the armed group, Adam Al-Klad, who was he was leader of the engineering division. So he designed the rockets that had killed multiple civilians and Syrian Arab Army soldiers during the occupation of that area. He turned up. So I'm standing in a white helmet center with the leader of the group talking to me, and he's talking to me like telling me they're having protests tomorrow and so on, and I'm invited because I'm from Britain, and I politely declined. And he said, oh, don't worry, I'll call BBC and CNN directly and send them the videos. They'll cover it. Don't worry about it. I'm like, okay. Jeez. So that's the thing, when the BBC makes you high profile, not only the BBC, The Guardian, Channel 4, Huffington Post, Chris York wrote 12 articles, I think, about me. I mean, he was my official stalker. He's now in Ukraine, by the way. He's writing for The Sun, which I think is very appropriate. And when they make you high profile like that, in my view, it's done deliberately to make you very visible to the armed groups.
And vulnerable.
Right, to make you a target when you're in these situations.
Exactly. And to step back for a second, when you first got there, you're with the terrorist group and you have the Iranian journalists with you. Just in case the audience doesn't realize this, Iran is a friend of Syria. So if he was identified as an Iranian, it would have been game over for everybody at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's actually Syrian, but he's worked for Maidan since the beginning of the war. So very much the same thing. They would still have judged him as an infidel. And yeah, for sure. Came over.
How much danger would that, you're standing next to him, where would that put you?
Oh, well, at that point, it would be in the same boat, basically. Yeah.
And this is a behind-the-scenes look at the work that Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett do, which is, you've got James Bond rolled up with Walter Cronkite, rolled up with Bob Perry, rolled up with, I mean, you've got all of this going on, and it deserves strong support. And I want to take this moment. We're going to take a break in a few minutes again. But where's the best place for them to find you? And we want to know how to support you. So where are you
really
crowdfunding
kind, George.
right now?
I'm mostly on Substack. I'm still on Patreon, Subscribestar. Those are the three main ones. If people, Substack is probably the main one, and on Rockfin also, although actually I don't really understand the whole system there. So Substack is probably the best one now.
And they can find you under just your name, Vanessa Beeley?
Yeah, just my name. Yeah, just Vanessa Beeley on Substack, and they should be able to find me quite easily.
And, if you're looking for war correspondents to support, this is one of the best. That's literally, she is one of the best. Now, so you got through that. Is that just typical Syria? Break this down. Break this down for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's typical. Actually, maybe it's typical Syria. I was going to say it's typical war reporting to some extent. There's always a huge amount of confusion in the field. I mean, for example, we'll maybe talk about that after the break. We'll talk about the attack that happened this Sunday just past in Elbia, the Syrian Christian town in Hama. But this, I mean, in the midst of an attack, there's a huge amount of confusion. There's a huge amount, and actually, even though you're there, you still need to do an awful lot of work afterwards to get to the bottom of what actually happened. You know that. War is a very confusing environment, not only because you're under attack, your life potentially is in danger, but also because there is a lot of confusion in war. And this is what I always say to people, when Western media puts out a story and they're absolutely certain of their conclusions, and they're drawing those conclusions from Washington, London, New York, Beirut, they're wrong. 100% they're wrong. Syrian media can even get numbers wrong on the day of the attack. God bless them. But this is normal. Well, it's no reflection on them. This is normal.
Well, you've got adrenaline pumping, fear. You've got, people are worried about other people, trying to find them, etc.
Yeah.
And it makes it crazy. Now, we've got to take that break right now, and then we want to get into what happened the other day. This is George Eliason with TNT Talk Radio. We'll be right back.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
There's not much you can do about what you're being told across the board. I guess the only way to try to examine things that you may not hear in the mainstream media is to go searching for them. And here at TNT, of course, we do a lot of searching. One thing I have noticed over the past 4 or 5 years, and it's very interesting, equatorial areas in the middle of the summer, along with the polar regions, the North Pole, have been cooling. Now, I'm not the kind of person that says, okay, that's it, everything is turning around, especially since the overall global temperature is warm. But there is something different going on than there was 10 to 15 years ago. This is weatherbell.com meteorologist Joe Bastardi for TNT Radio, reminding you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
My name is Teresa Barber. I was in the United States Navy, and I served overseas in the Middle East and Africa. Early on in my career, I had a commander that taught our suicide prevention training, and the very next day, he took his own life. 90% of suicide attempts involving a gun are fatal. My way of continuing my service is to help protect my community by being a responsible gun owner and by storing firearms safely. Store all your guns securely. Help stop suicide.
Brought to you by End Family Fire and the Ad Council.
Show me the studies.
Today's News Talk Radio.
True studies. This is safe for adults, much less kids.
TNT Radio.live.
This is TNT Talk Radio. Welcome back. I'm with Vanessa Beeley, and we're going to get into a terrorist attack that just occurred in. Now, the town's name is El Squilvia.
Sukalabia. Yeah, Skelbia, you can call it as an easier pronunciation. Yeah.
Okay. You were there. This bomb went off 4 meters from you. Explain today the setup. Now, it was a dedication for a church. What happened?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think if we remember that just before this event, there was the trilateral meeting in Tehran between President Erdogan, President Putin, and Raisi of Iran, during which, of course, Erdogan had a real knuckle rapping, in my view. The language used by both Putin and Khamenei made it very clear that if Erdogan were to go ahead with his military incursion, another one, into Syria, then he would not only be facing Syria, he would be facing Iran and Russia also. So, this was a very clear message. And I felt very much that Erdogan was rather like he was on the naughty step, I'm belittling the sheer evil that Erdogan has carried out inside Syria since the beginning of this war and what he's enabled and incubated in Turkey. And how he is now funding and arming and equipping various, mostly Muslim Brotherhood groups in Idlib that are actually in competition with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Al-Qaeda branch of, largely affiliated to the United States coalition. So although Turkey and US and NATO member states, they still compete via their proxy groups within Syria for power, status, territory, resources, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. And so immediately after this summit, the terrorists themselves in the Northwest effectively launched a new campaign, which began on the Friday. So that will be the 22nd. And I arrived in Skelbia on the 22nd, and that evening, Skelbia was targeted to the west of the town with Grad missiles. 4 or 5 Grad missiles hit the west of the town. Luckily, they didn't hit any dwellings or any civilian infrastructure. They just hit in farmland. But effectively, that started a campaign from north of Aleppo down to Latakia, down to Al Gab Plain and Hama, and northern Hama if you like, on the border with southern Idlib, which houses the armed groups controlled and actually supported by Turkey. Turkey now has 115 military bases in the northwest of Syria. It provides drone surveillance for the terrorist groups that it controls, right? When I was in Jurin, for example, which is on that kind of front line, we were effectively targeted. We were spotted by Turkish drones that then brought in the shelling by the terrorist groups. So I can attest to the fact that Turkey is working with the terrorist groups to target civilians in Jurin using, by the way, American-manufactured weapons, because we found during that attack an unexploded American-manufactured TOW missile, which is an anti-tank missile. It should never be used against a civilian target. So we had, if you like, a warning on the Friday. The ceremony was on the Sunday. Now, the ceremony was the consecration of the replica Hagia Sophia Church. And the history of that is in 2020, Erdogan, in his wisdom, converted what was originally a Christian temple, then under Ataturk, I think. It became a museum. He then converted it to a mosque. And effectively mothballed all of the Christian icons and relics that had been contained in the museum. So this wasn't the only church that Erdogan did this to in Istanbul and further afield in Turkey. So this was a clear message from Erdogan against Syrian Christians, particularly Orthodox Christians, and against Russia, because of course the Orthodox Christianity is very much a link between Syria and Russia. And so Nabil al-Abdullah, who's the leader of the Volunteer National Defense Forces in Skelbiye, in 2020, he made the decision to build a replica Hagia Sophia church in honor of the Russian and Syrian martyrs during the war, but also as a message to Erdogan that he will not destroy Christian heritage in the Middle East, that if he tries to destroy it, it will be reborn. Yeah, it's a very important, strong message to send because, of course, what is the West effectively trying to do? It's trying to empty the Middle East of its Christian communities because it knows if it does that, it's a much more vulnerable area because then you can ignite sectarian war between Shia and Sunni much more easily because you don't have that buffer zone of Christianity, if you like. I mean, that's a very simplistic explanation, and, you know, it can be gone into in more depth.
That's what Syrian culture is, essentially, in the area.
Exactly. Very diverse. It's always been a very diverse secular culture, and that's what they tried to destroy. So this was a very symbolic day, a very historic day. There were more than 1,000 people attending, including foreign diplomats. There was the Hungarian chargé d'affaires. There were diplomats from Abkhazia, from Serbia, from Russia. Small contingent of military, to be honest. The National Defense were there, of course, including the female snipers, all of whom are mothers, sisters, wives, daughters of martyrs, and they formed a sniper group trained by Russia to defend the town during the terrorist siege, which was alleviated in 2019. And so all these people gathered for the religious consecration of the church and in honor of the martyrs whose names are written on the walls surrounding the church. It's a beautiful, it's such a symbolic gesture by Nabil al-Abdullah. It's incredible. And he had their Shia Muslim leaders, he had Sunni Muslim leaders, one of whom was talking when the suicide drone fell. And so in the midst of the ceremony, the terrorists attacked with suicide drones, technology supplied, of course, by Turkey, to Abu Muhammad Jolani, the leader of HTS or Al-Qaeda, who has recently been whitewashed by the United States, and of course enabled by NATO special security forces on the ground in Idlib alongside the terrorists. And literally 4 meters from where we were sitting, the first one didn't explode, thank God. It landed, but it didn't explode. The second one landed directly behind the statue, honoring the Syrian Arab Army, and it exploded. What saved us was the statue one, which is still standing, very symbolic of the Syrian Arab Army, and one national defense soldier, Hisham Elias, whose body took the brunt of the blast, and actually he died from his wounds almost immediately after. But had that missile landed 2 meters further in, we wouldn't be here talking to you now, for sure.
Right. And I mean, that's just, it's, I guess for a war zone here, it's part of, I don't want to say, well, be a normal day, because it's a normal day for someone here. But to have that happen for that kind of ceremony, where you have, if they say that, they're an Islamic army, okay, that these, the Islamic State guys, they're going to kill Islamic leaders from both factions of Islam, plus secular leaders, plus, and it just shows their cards right there. Now you started, the footage you put up, you didn't film. Right?
No, it was filmed from, there were two videos of the explosion, one taken from behind where we were sitting, closer to the road, but you can see the force of the blast there, and actually 7 others were injured, including 2 teenagers who were taken to hospital. And then the other one from the perspective of someone filming, the Sunni imam who was speaking, heard the drone and then saw the explosion, and you can see the mass panic at that moment when, as I said, more than 1,000 civilians fled in panic. And bear in mind that this town had been under attack for something like 6 years. It had been surrounded by terrorist groups, some less than 500 meters away, literally. And they'd had 2 years of peace. So, the hysteria and the trauma was really overwhelming, even after the event. And then the fact that, one of their young men and another martyr from the town, Hisham, who was only, I think, 20 or 21 years old. And the sad thing was, I knew the guy, and he was so proud in the morning to stand and mirror the statue, have his photo taken next to the statue. And in fact, he refused to move from that spot. He wanted to be next to the statue during the ceremony. And really and truly, he saved our lives. He saved lives on that day, but sadly, he lost his. But, I think also what is astounding, George, is there was no mention of this in Western media, not one. Syrian Observatory of Human Rights just about mentioned it, but they basically claimed it as a revenge attack for the Russian attacks against, in inverted commas, children the day before, when in fact Russia had responded to the terrorist attacks on the Friday and had bombed terrorist enclaves in various areas of Idlib. And Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, of course, they are also EU funded. And it's a single man in his basement in Coventry in the UK reporting on the Syrian conflict. And he framed it as a revenge attack against what? Civilians, children, teenagers.
Exactly.
I mean, but there's no outrage, nothing. I even challenged Mark Cutts, the head of OCHA, UN Agency for Humanitarian Affairs, on Twitter. Nothing, not even a flicker, not one response. And what does the British government do in response or as reward for the terrorist attack? They sanction the Syrian Christian leaders of the Volunteer National Defense Forces. Why? Because they're allies of Russia.
You've got 1 minute
you
left,
can't make
Vanessa.
this stuff up. Yeah.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly, because they do the same thing here. But the war in Syria, what's happened in Ukraine is hard, but it doesn't compare it's not even in the same neighborhood as what's going on over there. Thank you so much for coming today. And I hope to have you
thank you
back
for having
soon.
me on. Oh, I'd love to, George.
Right,
thank you so much, and look after yourself.
You too. This is George Eliason with TNT Talk Radio, and we'll see you after the hour.